Hello everyone! I hope you've all been keeping well in this yet another day in the clown decade. This week has been an interesting week because there has been a National Conservatism conference, and this isn't some wet Tory party, or aren't we going to lower taxes and then do the opposite? No, this is an independent institution that genuinely seems to be after something genuinely right-wing. So from their About page, the National Conservatism Conference brings together public figures, journalists, scholars and students who understand that the past and future of conservatism are inextricably tied to the idea of the nation, to the principle of national independence, and to the revival of the unique national traditions that alone have the power to bind people together and bring about their flourishing. We see national conservatism as the best path forward for a democratic world confronted by a rising China abroad and a powerful new Marxism at home. We see the rich tradition of national conservative thought as an intellectually serious alternative to the excess of purist libertarianism, and in stark opposition to political theories grounded in race. In other words, they sound just like me, although no doubt I will be far too libertarian for some of the people who support national conservatism, but, well, we've got bigger fish to fry. But I'm not going to go through the whole thing. They have a whole YouTube channel with the speeches recorded. I recommend you go and check any out that will interest you. But for today we are going to be focusing on a few excerpts, mainly because leftists are going to ignore absolutely everything in a speech and take some excerpts out of context. And even when taken out of context, there is nothing wrong with them, but they are leftists, so what do you expect? So first things first, I may as well introduce this one first. Douglas Murray was a keynote speaker at the National Conservatism Conference with a speech titled Love, Gratitude and Aspiration, which in summary, the speech was about how a British nationalism is about keeping people who are within the country and wish to support the country and be supported by the country can come together and make a workable society. But there's one particular clip that kept being talked about, so we may as well go through that clip now. Take it away, Douglas.
This is in some ways still a controversial thing to say. Because in Europe in particular, nationalism, after all, sounds different depending on the country you're in. Nationalism in Israel sounds different to nationalism in America, sounds different to nationalism in Italy, sounds different to nationalism here in Britain.
And that's all true and is a fair point. Israeli nationalism seems to be a good thing, according to most people. American nationalism can be a good thing, can be a bad thing, depending who you ask, when you ask most people. Italian nationalism, that's where it starts to get a bit iffy due to their history of the mid-20th century. And British nationalism, well, read George Orwell if you want a deep discussion on that, but essentially, British nationalism is good depending if you are asking generally right-wing people, and if you ask left-wing people, it is the worst thing that has ever happened to the planet. And Britain essentially doesn't deserve to be a country. And Douglas Murray is obviously on the side of British nationalism is actually a good thing.
But the cordon sanitaire, which used to exist around nationalism until recent years, existed not because we didn't trust the idea of love of country, not because, I would argue, there was anything wrong with nationalism in a British context. It all came from a recognition that there was a problem with nationalism in a German context.
Yes, and you can just have irrefutable proof of this because every time nationalism comes up as a topic, mid-century Germany or Nazi Germany is what is always invoked by the person arguing against the nationalism. Despite the fact that obviously German or Nazi nationalism was a very specific type of nationalism that absolutely everyone agrees was horrendous, at least everyone in polite society.
And that is simply a historical fact. But I see no reason why every other country in the world should be prevented from feeling pride in itself because the Germans mucked up twice in a century.
Now, if you've just listened to that and agree with the whole thing, then congratulations, you are a sensible person. And you might be surprised to hear that this is what has caused controversy. Yes, Douglas Murray saying the Germans did nationalism badly and understating that fact is what has caused controversy, and obviously we're going to go through that now. Specifically, we are looking at a podcast called The Newsagents, which is a podcast hosted by ex-BBC presenter Emily Maitlis and other ex-Sky News presenters, who, despite having to be impartial in the past when working at the BBC, once leaving the BBC decided to say that the whole thing is run by Tory spies. I think if I was to summarise this podcast in a sentence, it would be liberal leftist normiecore. So let's hear what this new elite has to say about what Douglas Murray said.
Consistent conspiracy theories, talk of cultural Marxism, talk of the blob, talk of imaginary enemies, talk of the cosmopolitans and all of this stuff. To me, it was the apotheosis of what has been happening on the British right for 10 years.
So obviously, initially with this clip, we're looking at a wider context of the National Conservatism Conference. And this guy on the screen, Lewis Goodall, he is a current LBC presenter and used to be a presenter on BBC Newsnight and Sky News. Needless to say, this is a man who is trying to describe water while being a fish. He is completely surrounded within the BBC, within Sky News, and also within LBC by other journalists who more than likely got an internship paid off the back of their parents in London and have effectively become part of this metropolitan blob. So when he says, oh, there are imaginary enemies, it is because they are not his enemies and he is in fact part of those imaginary enemies. So he's having trouble getting his head around that idea, but obviously if you can't even get the basics of this argument right, you are not going to do very well arguing against it.
Which was going down an internet rabbit hole. It was the end point of the way that the internet, frankly, has kind of ruined much of the British right.
I mean, I have to agree, there are people on the online right who have absolutely frazzled their brains. But it's quite ridiculous to blame this on the internet. One of the first things Margaret Thatcher did when she became Prime Minister was effectively stand in front of a load of civil servants and say to them, yeah, we're going to gut the civil service from the inside out because it's awful. And she didn't get a clap, and she couldn't understand why. And then someone basically had to tell her, well, you've just told all these people that you're going to make sure they don't have jobs soon. And the arguments from the right wing aren't that different from Margaret Thatcher's day. There is still obviously a massive issue with the civil service, with journalists, with the middle managers in London offices, because all these people are trying to have a reputation of effectively being the most libertine people that you can imagine. If someone wants to do something, then it should be their right to do it, unless, of course, it's remotely going to insult anyone who isn't white, straight, or male. Unless, of course, they are a male who is pretending to be a woman. And obviously that's just been the influence of intersectionality over the past couple of decades. In Margaret Thatcher's day, it was simply just, we all hate anybody with money.
And that's why I think when you call it an ideology, or when you suggest that you're interested in ideology, it's quite a generous view. Because if you look at what is uniting some of these flavours, which is hard Brexit, populism, nationalism, anti-immigrant, anti-globalisation, prejudice, anti-woke, bit of climate denial, anti-vax, maybe a little side soupçon of homophobia thrown in.
I mean, already, I think I've mentioned it a few times before, but it's going to be a common thing I reference in my videos from now on, but Matt Goodwin recently wrote a book called Values, Voice and Virtue, and I haven't actually read it yet, but I have been listening to a lot of Matt Goodwin recently when he's been interviewed about this book. And to summarise, it's essentially things that we already knew, except this has incredibly good data backing it, and we can have a better idea of where all this intersectionality and all the ideology came from and how it's been growing over the past few years. But effectively, this podcast is three people who are just amalgamations of your typical new elite, or in this specific case, leftist journalists. This whole podcast is just going through this conference saying we can just dismiss all this because there are a lot of opinions that we simply disagree with, and they don't really need to engage beyond that. I mean, this is quite a long clip, luckily, but just from the one clip of Douglas Murray I have given you, it is simply just a, yes, British nationalism is good, we will avoid German nationalism and the things that made German nationalism bad as much as we can, because we don't want bad nationalism, we don't want to unjustly discriminate against other races, we just want people in Britain who are going to happily be part of British society. But I do find it quite funny how homophobia was thrown in there when two of the keynote speakers are openly gay men. But whatever, let's just carry on.
I think you'd be hard-pressed to say there is an actual ideology. It's just a lot of distrust or distaste in modern progressive life. Maybe that is an ideology.
I don't think Emily's far off this. This is certainly a broad church of different ideologies coming together, all of which, as she actually accurately says, is against progressive life, because progressive life is horrendous. It's making everything worse. There's barely any social metric that has improved thanks to progressive life, so of course people are going to be against it.
But I also think that probably there is no real unity there from one candidate or from one speaker to another. They're just all on a platform of sort of hating something.
Well, that's kind of what a forum is. It's to come together, bounce around ideas off each other, and then hopefully the best ideas will stick. Because there's been some people up on the podium who've been saying, oh, this is all thanks to hyper-globalized free markets and capitalism. That's what's ruined everything. We need to bring back more state control. And then there's been other people who go up, like, say, David Frost, saying, actually, this is all down to too much state control over everything. And that is why you have things like the Equality Act that forces diversity and inclusion officers into every industry and every company, and why we have hate crimes on the books, and why people are going away from making a pug do a Nazi salute. So yes, there's no one specific ideology, but what does bind all these people together is the fact that they know there is a large problem with progressivism.
Well, isn't it slightly the ideology of, and another thing that raises my blood pressure and makes me angry?
It's like a drunken rant. I mean, half of the stuff, it was the politics of the bar, of the pub late on a Friday night.
Well,
yes, and this is the thing. That is exactly the type of person that progressive life has been pushing against. You know, these people can't smoke in the pubs anymore. These people were banned from going to the pub for nearly a year and a half thanks to lockdowns. These are the people that don't want these leftist journalists dictating exactly how they should think and act. And yet, just because it will be these people agreeing with, ironically, people like Jacob Rees-Mogg and Douglas Murray, that's then giving them just the perfect reason to dismiss them in their minds. Oh, it's just drunken rants from down the pub, it's just homophobia, it's just racism. And it's exactly how they have been shutting down debates for years, even all the way back to Enoch Powell with his Birmingham speech. And once again in Clown Decade it's getting worse and worse, because even when absolutely 100% agreeable things are said, there's a controversy.
let us just hear a little sample of some of the speakers that we have assembled for you here on the Newsagent, so you can get a flavour if you weren't lucky enough to attend yourself.
Well, this is far and away the best part of the podcast and the clip, so I am just going to let it run with my commentary. But they start with Douglas Murray's clip that we've already gone through, so I'm going to skip that.
Marriage is not all about you. It's not just a private arrangement. It's a public act by which you undertake to live for someone else, for their sake and the sake of your children and the sake of wider society. And wider society should recognise and reward this undertaking.
Can you see what I mean? To progressives, that is a mental thing to say. Yet that is exactly what marriage was for millennia, across cultures. Their idea, and the idea that was most successful, was saying that you are going to go in front of a god if you're religious, or wider society if you're atheist, let's say, and make vows to your partner to say, I will stick with you through thick and thin, no matter what. We are together for life. We are going to make this work. And obviously in his speech he was criticising the fact that there are no-fault divorces, and it's simply too easy to walk away now. And don't get me wrong, there are legitimate reasons to walk away from a marriage. But then when you make it too easy, well, that's obviously going to have knock-on effects into wider society. Divorce rates and single motherhood has gone up over the past few years, and oh, look at that. So has youth violence.
And there is something peculiar about our current political moment, where those of us advancing unfashionable facts are beaten over the head with fashionable fictions.
I absolutely love the music in the background, by the way. Like, this is a very sinister speech. You should be worried about these people. But I do just find it incredibly funny how Suella Braverman is saying, look, I am bringing out the facts here. There are just a ridiculously high number of people coming across the channel on boats, let's say. And there is a high amount of violent crime going on, and we need to do something about it. whenever they try and do anything about it, say stop and search or a Rwanda plan, then you just get a load of people, like on this podcast, saying, well, that's a bunch of racists, let's not do anything like that, there's no problem here actually, yada yada yada. You know the arguments there. And yet, that is exactly what this podcast is doing. They say at the start, like, oh, these are imaginary enemies, nobody does this. And then they immediately do it.
The ethnicity of grooming gangs and the perpetrators in those gangs is the sort of fact that has become unfashionable in some quarters, much like the fact that 100% of women do not have a penis.
Again, absolutely nothing uncontroversial there. I nearly said a lot. Well, it is a lot, but I nearly said majority, which would have been wrong. But a very large, disproportionate amount of Pakistanis were involved with grooming gangs. That is just a fact. And yet every time it's brought up, it's, oh, look at the Home Office, though. They said majority of the perpetrators were white. It's like, of course they were white. 90% of the country is white, or at least it was when the grooming gangs were first looked into. So, yeah, no duh. And obviously the women don't have a penis thing, well, that's just obvious as well. But this podcast is pointing it out with this music and saying, actually, none of this is true. This is all just scare tactics. Look how nasty this National Conservatism Conference is. Let's see who's next.
Rishi Sunak made a specific promise to scrap thousands of EU laws. There's a little video with a shredder working overtime, but he's broken that promise. And this is very unfortunate, as one of his virtues is his trustworthiness, and the surrender to the blob risks exposing the government to ridicule.
I mean, again, that's just true. Rishi Sunak did promise that EU laws on the UK statute books would be shredded, and he's gone directly back on that promise. And I suppose that their problem there is that Jacob Rees-Mogg said, oh, he surrendered to the blob. Well, yes, who would have stopped that? Who do you think the forces are that are stopping that? It is left-wing journalists, it is managers within the civil service, it will be permanent secretaries. Because you really need to ask yourself, who else would it be that stops that? Why would Rishi Sunak go back on that promise? Other than it would take far too much political capital to, well, get the people who would make that happen, i.e. the civil service, actually do their job and do what they have been put in place to do, which is to enforce policy that the government has put in.
How much do you love your country? How much do you love the values that you claim to defend? Do you love them enough to tweet under your own name? Do you love them enough to change your child's school to one that's less woke and ignore the impact on your social status? Do you love them enough to do more than simply chat to your friends who already agree with you at dinner parties? For heaven's sake, man, stand up and be counted!
Yeah, I mean, again, we know that there's wokeness in schools. That's not a secret. We know in Scotland, for instance, that they tell the kids, don't tell your parents if you have decided to change gender. We know some schools are teaching kids as young as 6 how to touch themselves. We know through research from Eric Kaufman that at least, or the majority of school children hear about critical race theory or white privilege and other intersectional ideas through schools. So the speaker's point here is just to say, well, if you say you're against this, why don't you do something about it? And there's nothing wrong with that. That's just voting with your feet.
Don't go to dinner parties. Do you go to dinner
Probably
parties?
talking about you.
Yeah, don't go
Definitely
to
the two of you.
Don't go to dinner parties in a North London townhouse, I think was the subtext of what she was saying.
I mean, there was just no introspection whatsoever there. It's just dismiss everything they say. There can't be anything wrong with us. It's all them. Despite the fact that none of these people ever saw Trump coming, ever saw Brexit coming, ever saw Farage coming, ever saw Boris coming. And if they continue like this, well, they'll probably never see Kemi Badenoch coming. I mean, my prediction going out now, and if I'm wrong, I'll give, I don't know, 100 quid to a charity of viewers' choice. I think that it's going to be a Labour win, probably a majority, holding majority of Parliament. They're going to muck quite a few things up, and then it's going to end up with Kemi Badenoch after Rishi Sunak's kicked out of the leadership of the Conservative parties. It'll be Kemi Badenoch put in place by a membership vote, obviously, and we will see her be leader of the opposition for 5 years, and then I think people in the UK will like her enough to want to have them as her PM and like her party enough to vote them in as their representatives. And I think that would show us the perfect clown decade arc, but, well, we're a good 6 years off finding that out. I fully intend to keep this channel going for that amount of time. Anyway, that was how the established new elite reacted to just some of the clips from the National Conservatism Conference. It's now time to look a bit down the pecking order to Novara Media, who are simply budding new elitists. Take us away, Michael Walker.
The National Conservatism Conference has had some pretty reactionary and sometimes wacky speeches.
Of course you'd find them wacky. You're a communist. If a speech seems wacky to a communist, that means that perfectly reasonable things were said. That is one thing I've found out from talking to communists.
Suella Braverman has railed against multiculturalism.
Good, that's because multiculturalism has been a disaster.
Douglas Murray has called Nazism a case of Germans mucking up.
Once again, understating things is a classic British way of making a point, and either way, he's saying that Nazism's bad. I think it's, I think someone has a pretty good opinion if they think Nazism is bad.
And now, it's the turn of disgraced historian David Starkey.
I mean, you say disgraced historian, he's still regularly on GB News, and his profession is still as a historian. It's not like he's David Irving. It's just, once again, you say a uncomfortable fact or 10, and that makes you controversial. And oh, has David Starkey done it again? Of course he has. He's a madman.
The official account for the NatCon conference tweeted this out. The reason that the left has such ire for the Jews is jealousy. They want to replace the Holocaust with slavery in order to wield its legacy as a weapon against Western culture. And then you can see David Starkey at the hashtag NatConUK. Now,
I mean, it's an idea I've not really thought about before, but the more you think about it, yeah, kind of makes sense. The Holocaust is seen by most people, and rightly so, to be honest, one of the worst, if not the worst, extermination and genocide in history. The only reason that it stopped was because the Germans were losing, and so as they realised that they were losing ground, they decided, oh, we've got to stop this and actually just destroy all the evidence we can that it happened. The Nazis actually understood it was evil, otherwise they wouldn't have bothered doing that. And with slavery it was a little different. When slavery, in the British context, was outlawed in 1833 and the West African Squadron was founded to stop slave ships going across the Atlantic, the slave owners weren't punished. They were simply told, right, we understand that these slaves have a value to you. Instead of forcing you to give them all up because you're obviously going to not be particularly happy about losing all that value, we will pay you for their release instead. And that's what happened. And quite frankly, I don't think it's particularly controversial to say that slaves were treated slightly better than Holocaust victims. And clearly what the Holocaust has done is caused Germany to never want to seem nationalist in any way ever again. And that is exactly what leftists want of nationalists. Because they are quite open, some of them about not even wanting nations to exist full stop, and others are quite clearly just trying to get revenge for evils that happened 200 years ago and were rectified 190 years ago, with an apology even that came from Prince Albert saying, I wish we would have done this sooner, this is a permanent black stain on Europe. We have many regrets about it. The problem was acknowledged, the problem was fixed, we were in debt till 2014 because of that problem being fixed. It is in no way comparable to the Holocaust, and yes, I think David Starkey is correct that leftists do want slavery to be seen as bad as the Holocaust so that it can overturn Western nations. The logic is perfectly sound.
Now, lots of people, understandably, took offence to that tweet and it was promptly deleted.
Oh, that's weak from the National Conservatives. There was no need to delete that tweet. There was nothing wrong with it. Literally, the acknowledgement from David Starkey there is that both are evil. It's just, of course, one's going to be worse than the other.
That did make me wonder, maybe the social media person took him out of context. No, this is the quote from David Starkey, verbatim. It's not good.
Once again, if communists think that some sort of speech or fact is not good, bad, or evil, it is probably perfectly reasonable.
The narrative of Black Lives Matter is that Western culture and Anglo-American culture in particular are fundamentally and morally defective. They are characterized by the mark of pain, and their strategy is to do exactly what was done to German culture because of Nazism and the Holocaust, but the determination is to replace the Holocaust with slavery. In other words, this is why Jews are under such attack from the left. There's jealousy, fundamentally, there's jealousy of the moral primacy of the Holocaust and the determination to replace it with slavery.
Yeah, Labour had a massive problem with anti-Semitism. That was no secret. Even Corbyn had written a foreword for a book that had anti-Semitic tropes about how capital moves about the world. Literally, I don't understand where the controversy is in that, apart from that he is attacking the left directly for their anti-Semitism problem. Because he's not saying that there's no problem with anti-Semitism on the right. It would be foolish to say that there is no problem with anti-Semitism on the right. There's anti-Semitism everywhere, apart from, it seems, the centre. But for his whole speech to work, he has to acknowledge that both slavery and the Holocaust are bad. So what's the problem? He thinks these things are bad.
And they say that we're the ones doing oppression Olympics. Why are we having a competition between the moral primacy or whatever of two genocidal historical events?
What do you mean? That's David Starkey's exact point. You are the side of the oppression Olympics. You are the side that is doing that, whether you know it or not. I'm sorry, but this is Navarra Media. I have covered many Navarra Media videos. You are constantly going on about the oppression of certain ethnicities, genders, whatever. You can't come out now and say, oh, David Starkey is the one who's really doing oppression Olympics, when all he has done is pointed out that you keep doing oppression Olympics and it's led to anti-Semitism.
It's so egregious, and I actually think it's really difficult to overstate quite how terrifying the events of this conference, or this convention or whatever, this hellhole taking place in our city, how scary that is.
Just to clarify what she said there, because the sentence was all over the place, she has said that this National Conservatism conference is a very scary thing because David Starkey was saying that the left constantly play oppression Olympics and are now trying to say that slavery was worse than the Holocaust. And she's saying, why is he trying to compare the Holocaust and slavery? Can't he just say they're both bad? That's his point. He is saying they are both bad. And he's saying that it is your side that constantly want to make slavery to be the most evil thing in human history and pin it uniquely on Britain and America because you see Anglos and Americans and their culture as the most oppressive thing on the planet. And, you know, as I said before, when the Germans post-World War II and post-Holocaust and all that, they couldn't be nationalist ever again because of the outcome of the previous time they attempted it. And they want the same thing for Britain as a whole. They don't want Britain or America to exist as it has for centuries again because they see it as uniquely evil. This isn't that difficult. All David Starkey has done is put a mirror up to you and you say, wow, I find this reflection scary. And then because, let's face it, the people at Navarra Media are a bit dim, you don't see yourself in that reflection that David Starkey has shown you. You look straight through it and see him. And yes, that does make you a moron, by the way.
And I think we need to really understand, you know, on the one hand, we have David Starkey, you know, saying that there is a moral primacy to the Holocaust that is not afforded to other historical genocides.
Slavery wasn't a genocide. It wasn't even an attempted genocide. There were not crematoriums set up. There was not a whole system to say, bring them to these camps and put them to death. Don't get me wrong, there were a lot of deaths involved with slavery. That is an evil. But once again, you are just doing here what David Starkey has pointed out to you. There is a particular evil with the Holocaust that isn't generally put onto other genocides, whether it be the killing fields in Cambodia, the gulags in the USSR, or others, because this one was specifically based on ethnicity, with, of course, Jews being the main targets, but also Roma people and disabled people. And literal death camps, specifically camps to kill these people, were created. Again, that's not actually really happened with any other genocide. Even gulags were primarily prisons. They just had firing squads constantly shooting people in them. In Nazi Germany, they had literal crematoriums to hide the evidence.
And then at the same conference, you have Douglas Murray referring to the Holocaust and referring to Nazism as a muck-up of nationalism.
Again, understatement, not going to go through it. Be as dishonest as you want. The average person, when they see that clip, will know exactly what he means. They know that that rhetoric only works because it was a horrific regime. Saying it's a muck-up is obviously a joke, for God's sake.
And I actually think it's really important to understand that it's actually not a contradiction that those 2 points are being made in the same platform.
Again, I swear leftists are just so hive-minded that they don't understand that a forum is a place to have different opinions up anyway. So if it contradicts, it doesn't even matter. But I cannot wait to see what our reasoning is here.
Because what we are seeing here is that what is often made to seem like like solidarity with the Jewish community against anti-Semitism and against the rising threat of anti-Semitism, particularly from the far right, is not actually genuine solidarity from an anti-racist perspective.
Yeah, I know. That wasn't the point of his speech. The point of his speech was to say that leftists are continually trying to undermine our nation. The fact that the Holocaust majorly affected Jews doesn't matter. That's not the point he's making. Jews have literally nothing to do with this speech or the point being made. And the fact you don't understand that is a testament to your double-digit IQ. And on that point, yeah, of course he's not trying to be anti-racist. Anti-racist is a loaded term your side use to effectively say you need to be racist against white people. That is all that means. So of course he's not going to be anti-racist.
And that actually it is very important for us on the left to understand that despite growing conversations in the mainstream media and from, this very right-wing and racist government.
Sorry, I'm not going to lie. I'm not really trying to understand fully what she's saying there. I just want to stop there because, once again, this very right-wing and racist government with the highest tax burden on the general population since World War II, the highest amount of public spending ever, and a cabinet that is led by a British Indian with other minorities in the cabinet, the most ever, I think, apart from Liz Truss's. A black foreign secretary, a Indian home secretary. How is this a racist right-wing government? They're not anything of the sort, and it is a ridiculous thing for you to say.
About anti-Semitism, that actually it's very important that we understand that the Jewish community is at risk here and that they are actually left unprotected by the forces that are claiming to protect them, that is a disingenuous form of solidarity and concern.
Again, there was no solidarity and concern. All David Starkey was saying was that the Holocaust was very bad and it caused Germany to never be allowed to be nationalist again. And leftists want the same thing for that against Britain and America. And this might be where some anti-Semitism comes from, because they are jealous of that. But, there seems to be a side note in his speech anyway. The main point is that leftists are trying to undermine America and Britain. And obviously, David Starkey doesn't want that. A lot of right-wing people don't want that. That was the main crux of the argument. Methinks the lady doth protest too much. This is almost like she has heard the word Jew, heard a right-wing figure say, oh, yeah, there's a bit of an anti-Semitism problem in the left wing, and now she's going overboard with it, even though it wasn't the main part of his speech. Anyway, I'm going to cut out quite a lot of this clip here, because all she's basically saying is, when the right wing are sympathetic about anti-Semitism, they're faking it. That's essentially what she says.
It's incredibly concerning that we are in a position right now where they feel able, because these people have always thought this way, but what has changed is that they feel confident and safe enough, essentially, metaphorically, to state these on a platform and have it disseminated to the public.
So you're concerned that Douglas Murray said that Nazism was bad, and that David Starkey is faking his concern for anti-Semitism, even though, again, he didn't actually express any concern for it. It was mainly the point of they want to do the same thing to Germany, to Britain, etc. But you're concerned that they can say these things that, once again, nothing anti-Semitic about any of it, but you're concerned that they feel comfortable enough to go on a platform and say these speeches, and that's anti-Semitic or something. I think the funniest part about this is that the conference committee does have Jews on it. So once again, this feels very much like a stand back Jews, I got this. And the Jews are there literally organising the conference and being perfectly fine with these speeches. This, by the way, is why I hate identitarianism. It's just so stupid, and ends up making you say silly things like, oh, this is really insulting to Jewish people, when this conference has literally had Jewish people on the committee, and Jewish people as other speakers, of course. It's just a whole load of nothing.
This has moved from the private, this kind of thinking, to the public sphere. It is being resonated by and through our state.
Yeah, believe it or not, right? Most people, if not everyone working for the government, thinks that the Nazi Party was bad. And most of them wouldn't particularly care if you understate it. It is simple humour. Now, whether most of them think that there is a problem with anti-Semitism on the left wing, well, that's a different story. But saying something is anti-Semitic when it's not, hypothetically, let's say, that's still not anti-Semitism. So, I don't know what you're talking about.
And that is we are at an incredibly concerning juncture when it comes to the rise of the far right. And just because they're in, suits and they're speaking at the, I believe it was the Natural History Museum, doesn't mean that we shouldn't call a spade. And what this is far right language and rhetoric.
Well, you know what, Navarro Media? If far-right rhetoric is saying that the Holocaust was bad, and that Nazi Germany was bad, and that slavery was bad, I'll take far-right rhetoric. Call me a far-right rhetorician, because that is exactly the type of thing that I say all the time. I mean, honestly, the reach for these speeches has been absolutely insane, and again, Matt Goodwin is just absolutely right, and the problem is that these are the type of elites that the left wing of the Tory party have constantly been trying to hold an olive branch out to for the past few years, past few decades actually, ever since Cameron. So it's no wonder that the Tory party are collapsing under their own weight, because people are fed up with them not keeping their promises. And a lot of the Tories that went to the National Conservatism Conference appear to understand that and appear to know that they are about to be the opposition party and they now want to take their stand. So any Tory MP at the National Conservatism Conference, they have my full support. I hope that they remain as MPs for the coming years, and it'd be interesting to see how well they perform in opposition, assuming they have enough MPs to be in the opposition. But anyway, that's everything I had for you today, so once again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, goodbye.